everyone. Oh, my goodness, that was very loud. It's quite exciting. So I am your first keynote today, and as the first presentation of the day, it's my job to get everybody really excited and to warm the crowd up for the rest of the day. So that's my big goal with this talk, in addition to a few other small goals. And I'm gonna test that goal by measuring by how many people at the end of this talk have their laptops out and open. If I can get a ton of people to close their laptops, I'll know that I got you all warmed up. So I'm just gonna get started. Todd Lewis reached out to me in mid-September about doing this keynote. He wanted me to do a keynote-style version of a talk that I did on Monday on how to get started in open source as a beginner. And I agreed to do the keynote, and in typical Safia fashion, I didn't think much about it until mid-October. And then I thought back, and I've done variations of this talk before. I've done a lot of work around getting beginners involved in open source. And to be honest, I think there's a variety of perspectives and ideas and solutions to this question. They're a Google search away. There's 24 million of them. Heck, even people like me have piped into the discussion. And I knew my keynote couldn't just be a laundry list of ways that we can make open source more exclusive, or ways that maintainers can help their projects engage with new contributors, or things that developers can do to engage better with open source projects. The reality is there's a variety of experiences and stories and backgrounds. So it's difficult to provide a general keynote-style answer to any one of those things. The best thing that I can do really is just share my own story in open source and provide some of the lessons that I learned along the way. Before we get into my open source story, we have to get into my programming story. And for me, and a few people in their early to mid-20s, my programming story started on a website called neopets.com. I had a profile on neopets.com, and in order to customize my profile, I had to learn two languages, HTML and CSS. I was 10 years old at the time, and I used those two skills to build this pink, sparkle-ridden hellscape that you see here. And that was my first introduction into the power of software as a way to make your visions possible. And I was 10 years old at the time. I continued to be engaged in computers. I did a ton of work with HTML and CSS. I was playing around with Linux and a ton of stuff. My interest in programming continued, and around the time that I was 13, I went and picked up my first programming language, which was Python. I started off with Python, and I moved into JavaScript and C and a ton of other languages. This is actually a screen grab of a programming blog that I maintained for 4 months when I was in high school, because maintaining programming blogs is hard, and I've been trying to do it for almost 5 years, apparently. So there's that. But by the time I had kind of gone close to finishing high school, I'd done a ton of work with computers. I'd taken a few computer science classes in high school. I knew I wanted to do a computer science degree when I got into college, and I was set on that. So I went off to university. I'd been playing around with computers for about 7 years. At that point, I did my first year of college as a computer science major. And then summer rolled around. And summer is an interesting time if you're in college, because usually you want to do an internship or you want to travel or something like that. And I was an idealistic young 18-year-old who was really into programming at the time. And I did what most young idealistic 18-year-olds who were really into programming at the time would do during their summers. I figured out how to get the city that some of us love to hate on, San Francisco. I'd spent a summer there. I had landed a job, an internship, at a startup in San Francisco. I was making $2 above the minimum wage at this job. If there's one piece of profound thought leadership that I'm going to leave everybody with today, is if you ever encounter an 18-year-old who is young, broke, and has college bills to pay, they probably should not take a $15 an hour job at one of the most expensive cities in the world. but I did that. I worked at the startup during the day, and in the evenings, I would go home to my overpriced apartment. And it was in one of those evenings that I submitted my first ever pull request to an open source project. It was a project in the Python data science ecosystem. The project was called Pandas. Even thinking back on it, I'm not totally sure what compelled me to make that first pull request. I think one of the most important things to consider when doing anything is your intention, and my intentions were probably mixed at the time. I wasn't super confident in my programming skills. The first year of college in computer science was pretty difficult, especially for somebody who was self-taught and wasn't used to formal education in something that they loved. And at that point, I idealized open source maintainers. I thought of them as these demigods who could perform magnificent feats of computing. And I figured that if I could do something like they did, I too would be a good developer. As it turns out, that's not how self-confidence works. There was also a part of me that was really interested in accomplishing this personal goal of getting a pull request merged into a major project. And I can't tell you the elation that I experienced when I finally got it merged. I actually called up one of my best friends back in Chicago and squealed on the phone with him for half an hour because I was so excited. I'm pretty sure he's got residual hearing damage from all of the squealing and giggling and screaming that I did, that I had my first pull request in. And I did this in 2015, which is not that long ago. It was about 2 years ago. But I have an obsessive and dedicated personality. So once I find something, I go all in on it. And over the past few years, I've done a ton of work in open source. I've maintained a few of my own projects. I've contributed to other projects. I've worked in a maintainer role in larger projects. I've organized conferences, meetups, and workshops. I've presented at conferences, meetups, and workshops. I've written educational material. I have gotten grant funding for open source projects. I've done the whole shebang. And I think all of those contributions, all of those efforts that I have accomplished over the past 2 years might be the reason that I'm on stage here today, or so I think. And I might be considered an open source success story. I was someone who somehow managed to turn one pull request into this really engaging and fulfilling career in open source, which is still ongoing today. And while I don't have a secret formula to my success or a big idea, I do have 5 big insights. That was the tough transition to do. And these are things that I've learned in my 2 years of experiences in open source. As someone who's interested in a life in open source, but also as somebody who's coming at this with a fresh perspective, with younger eyes, and who's able to see things that those in the industry who've been here for a while might not see. And so the first thing that I quickly learned is that it's important for us to not just share code, but to also share knowledge. We've got a lot of tools and techniques around how we share our software and our code with other people. But the techniques that we've established for sharing knowledge are lacking universally. Things like documentation skills and communication skills. And I think this is critical because it lends itself to something deeper. When we don't have effective ways to share knowledge, it tends to concentrate in a few individuals. And the tech industry is a very information and knowledge-driven industry. So when knowledge is concentrated in the hands of a few people, whether they be open source maintainers or industry leaders, there's a power imbalance that emerges where you have few people who have a lot of the information and a lot of people who don't have all the information. And this power imbalance makes it difficult to A, keep projects that are long-living and engaged and successful for a long-term basis, and B, it inspires bad actors who hide behind this illusion that they know everything and that their knowledge is completely inaccessible to everybody else. And one of my key efforts in my journey in open source over the past 2 years has been to really focus on sharing my knowledge. I've written a lot of code, but I've also tried my best to get out at conferences, to write as much as I can, to make sure that the ideas and the code that I'm writing are not owned by me, that I have free ideas and open ideas in addition to free code and open code. And the second thing is I learned that friendship often beats mentorship. I'm a young person, so when older people try to give me advice, it usually has this like little tinge of condensation to it. And I found that I get the best advice from people who are my friends. And I made a lot of friends in open source, and there's an underlying implication to this friendship idea. And it's the fact that we should approach every relationship in our community as a two-way relationship. Everybody has something to teach you, and you have something to teach everybody. Regardless of how experienced you are or how inexperienced you are, you have an idea that's valuable and worthy of being shared. And I really wish that we as an industry would do our best to remove the hindrance and the notion that some ideas are bad ideas or stupid ideas. The only stupid ideas are ones that are enacted upon and have consequential damage. But other than that, every idea is valuable and worthy of being shared. And on the topic of two-way relationships, I also think that initiative in our industry is a two-way street. So, every maintainer should make the effort to make their open source project welcoming and inclusive to new contributors, but new contributors should also take the initiative to engage with open source contributors. Every maintainer should do their best to find and resolve bugs in their software and make releases appropriately, but every user should also take it upon themselves to provide meaningful, reproducible, and kindly requested bug reports. Every company should do an audit of their open source use and see if they can allocate some of their revenue to open source projects, but every maintainer should also go out of their way to setting up a financial support plan for potential corporate donors. And I think it's really important that our community is built on mutual trust between all parties involved, because that's something that bystanders or potential new contributors see. When you see that there's initiative taken on both sides, you realize that there's value in the relationship regardless of who is participating in it. And it's encouraging not just to people who might be interested in getting involved in open source, but to those who are observing our industry and our community, especially as it starts to become kind of conventionally popular. And then the fourth thing I learned is that there's no right way to do open source. So earlier I was putting success in air quotes, and the reason being is that success is a subjective metric. There's no one concrete definition of success. It's up to the person. Also earlier, you noticed that there were 24 million different resources around how to get involved in open source. Everybody has an idea and an opinion about how to do things right. And I think it's good to note that there's no actual way to do things right. You could be a maintainer in a large company-backed open source project. You could be somebody who's just maintaining a few modules on the side. You could be somebody who's working in a project that's funded by grants. Everyone has different goals and intentions in open source, and I think the key to success for us as a community is to figure out how to harmonize all of those different perspectives. And I think that particular problem of harmonizing all of those different perspectives is not just a people problem. It's a standards problem, it's a cross-collaboration problem, but it's definitely something that we need to kind of get resolved as a community, especially as open source takes a stronger hold in our society. And the last thing I wanted to share is not actually a lesson that I garnered directly from my experience in open source, but it's something that my work in open source has reinforced. It's actually inspired by a small proverb that I read in the back of an Arabic to English dictionary when I was 8 years old, and it stuck with me for a very long time. And it's inspired my life philosophy on a lot of things, and it goes something like this. Little drops of water, tiny grains of sand, make up the mighty ocean and the pleasant land. And this proverb reminds me to recognize the value of small things that fuel big change. The small open source modules that can be connected together to build a complete web app. The contributor who makes an occasional drive-by pull request that keeps a project alive. The person who's tweeting useful bits of information or writing interesting articles. It's been a reminder that no matter how insignificant or small my work might seem in the context of everything, it's still working towards a larger and bigger goal. And each action for all of us, no matter how small it seems, is helping us build the mighty ocean of open source. And whether you're just getting your start or you've been contributing for a while, we're all in this together. I think the answer to not just diversity and inclusivity, but to how to build more ethical, resilient software that pushes us forward as a species on the core principle of open source is that there has to be a large group of dedicated, empowered, and capable individuals who know that they can do great things. Thank you.